auto configuration. Auto configuration. To interact with, to develop persistence logics, we are using data JPA. To develop persistence logic, we are using data JPA. That is Spring Data JPA. We are using Spring Data JPA to develop persistence logic. Now, here Spring Data JPA. Spring Boot will use data JPA. It will create the connection. It will establish the connection with the database, and it will do all the necessary configurations that are required. To communicate with the database, we will configure data source properties in the application.properties file. To communicate with the database, we will configure data source properties in application.properties or application.yml. We are going to configure that in the application properties or application.yml file. To communicate with the database, we will configure data source properties in application.properties file or application.yml file. Based on the data source properties, based on our data source properties, Spring Boot will auto configure data source and required connections and transactions. Based on the data source properties, Spring Boot is going to auto configure required connections and transactions. Configure data source, required connections and transactions of our application. We no need to do the things manually because Boot is having a auto configuration concept. You just configure your data source properties. In the application.yml. The remaining thing will be taken care by Spring Boot only. You just need to configure the data source properties in the application.yml. Then the remaining things will be taken care by Spring Boot only. Are you guys able to understand this? Okay, now we have already developed some applications, guys, by using data JPA. You see, our 11th application is data JPA application, 13 SBMS people. Our 11th application is data JPA application. In that we configured data source properties. Let me open that application. 11th project. Open that. Yeah. Here you see, go to resources. Application.properties. Application properties. Now, guys, can you tell me what I am doing here? I'm configuring what is my driver class, what is my database URL, what is the username, and what is the password. Driver class, URL, username, password, I'm configuring. Driver class, URL, username, password, I'm configuring for my application. If I configure these details in the properties file, am I writing any code to get the connection? Or I am directly performing the operation? Am I writing any code to get the connection, or I am directly performing the operation for you? I am not writing any connection code. I am just configuring my data source properties. Then Spring Boot is taking care of establishing the connection with the database, establish the transaction with the database, everything will be taken care by Spring Boot. That is called auto configuration. So here, if you want to communicate with one database, the development is very easy. The development is very easy because Spring Boot will take care of everything. You just need to configure your data source properties in the .properties file or .yml file. So what is your database? What is the URL of your database? You configure that. What is the username of your database? What is the password of your database? What is the driver class you want to use for the database? Which database you are using? Respective driver class you need to configure. That's it. Then we are creating one simple repository by extending from CRUD repository. This is our interface. Our interface is extending the properties from CRUD repository. CRUD repository is a data JPA repository. It is providing the methods to perform CRUD operations. Now, simply by using that repository object, interface implementation object, we are going to call the save method. We are going to call the save all method, find by ID, find all by ID, delete method, delete by ID. There are so many methods are available in the CRUD repository. We are going to call those methods to perform our DB operations. Now tell me, is this concept is easy for everybody? Is this concept is easy for everybody? When we have single database connection, it is simple and very straightforward. Your application want to connect with one database, only one database. Then you configure that the database properties in the .properties file. Then Spring Boot will take care of all the required configurations to connect with the database. But if your application want to communicate with multiple databases, then the challenging comes into picture. That is the reason in every interview they are going to ask this question: how you will connect with multiple databases in your Spring Boot application. If you want to connect with one database, then one data source is sufficient. If you have one data source, then Spring Boot will take care of everything to communicate with the database. This is the application, 11th application you see. In my 11th application, I want to communicate with only one database. That database related properties, data source properties I am writing in the properties file. Then I am taking one repository, I am taking one entity, and I am calling the repository methods directly. There is no configuration I am writing here. No need to also, because single data source, Boot will take care of it. But if I want to communicate with multiple databases, suppose for example, one database is Oracle, another database is MySQL. I want to connect with the two databases in the single application. That is the topic for today. Are you guys able to follow me? How to connect with more than one database? Now, this is my Spring Boot application. And this is a database. Spring Boot app. And this is Oracle database. Assume that. Oracle database. My Spring Boot application want to communicate with this Oracle database to perform some operations. Then what I will do here? I will create one entity class and I will create one repository interface. That is sufficient. And data source properties. Where I will write the data source properties? Inside application.properties. Inside the application.properties file, I'm going to write my data source properties. Then Spring Boot will take care of application.properties file will contain the data source properties. What are the data source properties we are going to write? URL, username, password, driver. URL, username, password, driver that I am going to configure as a data source properties in the application.properties file. Then Spring Boot will take care of all the configurations which are required to communicate with the database. If we have single database or if you have single data source, if we want to connect with single database, then we will configure that database related data source properties in our application.properties file. Then boot will take care of all the configurations required to communicate with that database. As a programmer, you no need to do any additional configuration, guys. As a programmer, you no need to do any additional configurations. Whatever the configurations required for our Spring Boot application, everything will be taken care by any configuration that is required to connect with the single database, single data source. Spring Boot will take care of everything. What is your responsibility? Your responsibility is just to configure your data source properties in the application.properties file. What is the meaning of data source? Which database you want to connect? What is the driver class? What is the URL of the database? What is the username of the database? What is the password of the database? You just to configure like this. Then boot will take care of all the configuration, how to load the driver, how to establish the connection, how to handle the transaction. Everything will be taken care by Spring Boot. So our development is very easy. Our configuration is very simple when you want to communicate with a single database. That is simple and very straightforward. You no need to bother about anything here. Boot is taking care of everything. To connect with single database. Guys, are you clear? Are you clear with this? What boot is doing when we have single database? Are you clear with this? What boot is doing when we have single database? What boot is doing when we have single database? Someone is asking, repeat again. क्या करते हो भाई? I'm repeating from last 20 minutes. Again you asking, please repeat. It is just one word for you, but for me it is 20 minutes. Please understand. Before asking that, please repeat. What is there to repeat? It is already lent in the data JPA. Got it? Now, let's go for next thing. Now my requirement is not to one database, guys. I want to develop a Spring Boot application which will communicate with multiple databases. I want to develop one Spring Boot application. Which can communicate with two databases. I want to develop one Spring Boot application which can communicate with two databases like Oracle and MySQL. Anything, you can take any database. You can take Oracle and H2. You can take Oracle and MySQL. You can take Oracle and PostgreSQL. Like this, you can take any database. I want to develop my Spring Boot application which can communicate with multiple databases. Okay, this is my Spring Boot application. Spring Boot application. This is Spring Boot application want to communicate with two databases. That is the business requirement. In our project, we have that requirement. Our application should communicate with two databases. Here, I'm taking one database as Oracle. Here, I'm taking one database as MySQL. So this is very famous interview question, guys. Because it is not the regular concept. It is something special. Connecting with two databases in a single project. One database, let's assume that this is Oracle DB. Another database, let's assume that this is MySQL DB. One is Oracle DB, another one is MySQL DB. One is Oracle DB, another one is MySQL DB. Now, I want to store some data into Oracle DB and I want to store some data into MySQL DB, or I want to retrieve the data from multiple databases. Sorry guys. I want to retrieve the data from multiple databases. One is Oracle database, another one is MySQL databases. How you will do the configurations? That is the question. How your application can connect with more than one database? That is the question they are going to ask. What you need to write? What you need to write inside this project so that your project can communicate with multiple databases. So this is the topic. This is the question that they will ask in the interview. In the project also, sometimes you will get this kind of scenario. In the project, you will get this kind of scenario. Some data is available in the Oracle table. Some data is available in the MySQL table. You need to connect to both the Oracle table and MySQL table, and you need to retrieve that data. You need to connect to the Oracle table and MySQL table, and you need to retrieve that data. Got it? Right, guys. So much of configuration we need to take care, guys. So much of configuration we need to take care. Let me show you that configuration. It's all about configuration, how to connect with more than one database. Let me show you the configuration. The very first thing is, I will show you the properties file where we will configure data source. Now, if we want to connect with two databases, then we need to configure two data sources. To connect with two databases, we should configure two data sources in application.properties file. To connect with two databases, we need to configure two data sources in application.properties file. Okay. Now let me go to this multi-DB config properties file. Now, guys, can you see I have only one data source, or I'm having two data sources? I'm having one data source, I'm having two data sources, spring.user.data source, spring.book.data source. If you have only one data source, directly you can configure like this: spring.datasource.url, spring.datasource.username. But I want to differentiate the data sources. That's why I'm configuring the data source along with the name. Spring.user.data source, spring.user.data source, spring.user.data source password, user.data source.username, user.data source.jdbc URL, user.data source.username, password, driver class name. Okay. Then book.data source.url, book.data source.username, book.data source.password, book.data source.driver class name. How many data sources I'm configuring here, guys? How many data sources I'm configuring here? Two data sources. Here you can configure here within the database. Within the Oracle database, I have two users. IES dev is one user account, SSA dev is one user account. If you want, you can go for H2 database here. You can configure MySQL database also here. In my system, MySQL DB is not installed. If you have the MySQL DB, then you can configure MySQL data source properties here. Like this, we need to configure two data sources in our application.properties. You can configure two data sources like this in the application of properties file. Here I'm going to write JDBC : MySQL driver. What is the URL for the MySQL, guys? Can anyone tell me URL for the MySQL? Here I will give username as root and the password is root@123. Okay. Here I will give MySQL driver. MySQL driver I will pass. Here JDBC : MySQL : what is the MySQL URL? JDBC : MySQL : JDBC : MySQL : /localhost : 3306 / MySQL DB. Okay, this is the MySQL driver we are going to configure. MySQL.MySQL driver, package name.MySQL driver. Package name.MySQL driver. Here data source name you can give anything. Sir, do I need to give as only user? No, you can give as DS1. You can give as DS1. This is a data source 1. You can give any name. Here I will give it as DS2. That is just to represent this belongs to which data source. One data source name I am giving as a DS1. Another data source name I am giving as a DS2. DS1 belongs to Oracle database. DS2 belongs to MySQL database. Are you guys able to understand how to configure two data sources in the properties file? Are you guys able to understand how to configure two data sources in the properties file? You can give any name for the data source. So you need to give two data sources with two names. DS1 is one data source. DS2 is another data source. Okay. Now here I'm giving user as the data source name for the first one. That is Oracle data source name is user and the MySQL data source name is book. What I mean here user is I have a user table in the Oracle database. I have a book table in the MySQL database. That's the reason I'm giving two data sources here. That is the reason I'm giving two data sources with one data source name as user, another data source name as a book. You got my point? Now, can we connect with three databases also? Then what you need to do if you want to connect with three databases? I want to connect with Oracle, MySQL and PostgreSQL. You need to write one more data source. What I mean to say is, for every database, one data source we have to write. For every data source, we have to write. One data source. For every database, we have to write one data source. You got my point? Yes. Now, if you want to connect with inside the Oracle, do you have two schemas? So if you want to connect with two, same in the Oracle database, only two schemas are available. You configure schema 1 details here. You configure schema 2 details here. That's it. Here, if you see in my thing, Oracle database only. First data source is also Oracle database. Second data source is also Oracle database. But credentials are different. This is one schema. This is another schema. This is one schema. This is another schema. If you want to connect with the two schemas in the same database, you just configure your schema details. Data source 1, schema 2, data source 2. If you want to connect with another database, data source 1 belongs to first database, data source 2 belongs to second database. You can configure like this. Can I connect with the 4 databases, 4 different databases? Oracle, MySQL, Postgres, SQL Server, and H2. Can I connect with the 4 databases also? Guys, come on. Can I connect with the 4 databases also by using my Spring Boot? So what we need to do? What we need to do if we want to connect with the 4 data sources, 4 databases? Four data sources we need to configure. Data source 1, data source 2, data source 3, data source 4. Like this you need to configure 4 data sources. Are you guys clear with data source configuration for multiple databases in the properties file? Clear na? Very good. The next one is, guys, the next one is configuration. Little bit configuration will be required because we are writing multiple data sources. Na? For every data source, we need to write some configuration. For every data source, we need to write some configuration. Okay. Here, user.java, this is one entity, user table. For the user table, I have user repository. Okay. Now, 2 data sources are available. As per above configuration, we have 2 data sources. One is user data source. Second one is book data source. One is user data source and the second one is book data source. User data source belongs to Oracle. User data source belongs to Oracle, and book data source belongs to MySQL. Book data source belongs to MySQL. User data source and book data source belongs to MySQL. Are you guys clear with this? Now, inside this user data source, I am going to take one user entity. I'm going to take one user entity class, and a user repository interface. User entity class and a user repository interface to perform the operations. User entity class and a user repository interface. Here I'm taking book entity class. Here I'm taking book entity class and book repository interface. Book repository interface. Because these are 2 data sources. These are belongs to 2 databases. Now here user entity is one class which is mapped with user table. Table name is user TB. Table name is user TB. That means it is the user database table. If you look at this entity class, you will understand what is there here. If you look at this entity class, you will understand what is there here. This is a table available in the Oracle database. For this one, we are having user repository. User repository, which is extending from JPA repository. Are you guys clear with this user database now? User data source now? Look at the entity class. That is a user that belongs to user table, that is user TB. For that entity, I have one repository. That's fine. We no need to do anything here. It's common. User entity, user repository belongs to user data source, which is a Oracle. There is one table called user TV. Now similarly, for the book also, we have one entity. Book model is available. That is book.java. That is binded to book_tb. Now this book tb table is mapped to book class, that is one entity, and we have a book repository. To interact with the book table, there is one repository called book repository.java is available. Book repository.java is using book entity class, which is used to communicate with book tb, which is available in MySQL database. User repository.java is using user entity, which is binded to user tb, which is available in Oracle database. So are you clear with this? Entities and repositories. Are you clear with this entities and repositories now? Come on. Up to here, is there any confusion? Is there anything new? Is there anything new up to here? Nothing. Right? When you have a single database also, you will configure data source properties, you will create an entity class, you will create a repository. But here what I have done, I have created two entity classes, two repositories, because I want to insert the data into two tables. What are the two tables? One is the user table, another one is the book table. For a user table, I have created one entity. For that entity, I have created user repository. For a book table, I have created one entity, which is a book. For the book, I have created one repository, that is a book repository. Two tables are there, so for every table, one entity, one repository. So two tables, two entities, two repositories. Now, the question is, these two tables are available in the same database, or the two tables are available in two different databases? Two tables are available in the same database, two tables are available in two different databases, two tables are available in two different databases. So how many data sources we need to configure then? Two data sources. If you have the two tables in the same database, there is no point of today's class. We have already discussed in the data JPA how to communicate with a table in the database. We will configure one data source. Spring Boot will take care of everything. You just need to call the methods. But today the problem is the two tables are not available in the same database. The two tables are available in two different databases. User table is available in Oracle database. Book table is available in MySQL database. As we are having two databases, we are configuring two data sources because Oracle data source properties are different, MySQL data source properties are different. I want to communicate with Oracle as well as MySQL. User data I want to insert into Oracle database table. Book data I want to insert into MySQL database table. As I want to connect with the two databases, I am configuring two data sources. One data source is user, another data source is the book. For the table, I have created entity and I have created a repository. Are you guys clear with this? Any questions so far? It is very simple and straightforward. Got it? Now the problem will start. Okay. Configuration. How to tell to these data sources? Hey, user data source, you take user entity, user repository. Hey, book data source, you take book entity and book repository. How can we inform to the data sources this data source should use This data source should use user entity and user repository. User DS should use user entity and user repository. Book data source should use book entity and book repository. User data source should use user entity and user repository. It should use user entity and user repository. Now here we are having book data source. Book data source should use book entity and book repository. It should use book entity and book repository. So do you need to inform to the data sources which classes they need to use, which interfaces they need to use? Do you need to inform to the data sources which data source should use which entity, which repository? Now can you tell me, user data source should use which entity and which repository? Can you tell me, user data source should use which entity and which repository? User data source should use user entity and user repository. Book data source should use book entity and book repository. So we need to configure these details or not? Spring Boot will know which data source should use which entity, and Spring Boot will not know. Spring Boot will not know, because how Spring Boot will guess your tables now? Spring Boot cannot guess it. If you have one data source, Spring Boot will think that okay, everything will be available in the single database. So directly it will create the connections, it will establish the details, it will interact with the database. When you have the single data source, there is no confusion for the Spring Boot. When you have the single database, there is no confusion for the Spring Boot. But now, in our application, Spring Boot will have the clarity, or Spring Boot will not have the clarity. Can Spring Boot imagine that some tables are in the Oracle, some tables are in the MySQL? Which tables are in the Oracle? Which tables are in the MySQL? Spring Boot will know, or Spring Boot don't know now? Spring Boot don't know. You are asking the Spring Boot to create the two data sources. But for which tables, which data source it has to use to interact with the table, that is the problem here. If I have one data source, directly all the tables are available in the single database. But here, two data sources are available. Which data source should be used for which entity? That is the confusion for the Spring Boot. How can we give that information to Spring Boot? Hey Spring Boot, if you want to insert the record into user table, use user data source. If you want to insert the record into book table, use book data source. We need to tell that or not? We need to tell that or not? Now, we need to tell that. We need to tell that. Got it? We have created an entities for the tables. We have created entities and repositories for the tables. We have created entities and repositories for the tables. We need to write the configuration classes to inform to the Spring Boot which data source should be used for which entities. We need to configure, we need to inform the Spring Boot. We need to inform the Spring Boot. We need to inform the Spring Boot which data source should be used for which entity. We need to inform the Spring Boot which data source should be used for which entity class. For that, we will write configuration classes. We need to inform the Spring Boot which data source should be used for which entity class. For that, we will write configuration classes. If you see, here I have two configuration classes. One is userdb config, another one is bookdb config. What is the purpose of userdb config? Userdb config, this is the userdb config which is telling the Spring Boot to use user data source. Okay, this is the userdb configuration to use the repository interfaces and the entity classes belongs to user database will be loaded. For those things, one data source will be prepared by Spring Boot. That is userdb configuration. @configuration to represent this class as a configuration class. Enable transaction management. It has to take care of the transactions for your application. Enable the JPA repositories. Where is your repositories are available? Base package for your repositories of user database. So what are the repositories you are creating for user database tables? Those repositories should be having the base package. This is the base package to scan, to identify the repositories which belongs to Oracle database. Okay, so from the properties file, it has to load the data source. The data source name is user.data source. We have two data sources. One is user data source, another one is a book data source. So I'm going to load user data source. Then we are creating entity manager factory, auto DDL we are setting, and we are telling to that you have to use this package to load the entity classes. In this package only Oracle database entity classes are available. So you need to scan that package, you need to load those entities, and you have to use this transaction manager to establish, to create the data source which is required for user database. Similarly, if you go to bookdb, here I am telling to scan the package which is having book repository. The JPA repositories are available in this package which belongs to MySQL database. This is book data source. Book data source properties you have to load. And entity classes are available in this package. The entities belongs to MySQL tables. The entities belongs to MySQL database tables are available in this package. Persistence unit is the book, then build book transaction manager, and this is the transaction manager for that. So these are the configuration classes that we are writing to specify which package contains repositories for Oracle database and entity classes. Which package contains repositories and entities for the MySQL database. Those things we are writing by using DB configurations. For example, if you have 3 databases, then you need to create 3 configuration classes. If you have 3 databases, then you need to create 3 configuration classes. In these configuration classes, what we are telling? We are telling that you scan this package for user database, and this is the data source properties, and this is entity manager factory. There you are telling auto DDL, we are injecting the data source, and we are telling in which package entities are available for this. Okay, and here transaction manager we are taking. You got it? You understand, guys? Even I can't remember this code. I just copied it from the Google. If you have more entities also, no problem. We are not giving the class name, Rajesh. We are giving the package name. In that package, we can have multiple classes also. No problem. Now, am I giving the class name for the entity? I am giving the package name. Inside the package, can I create multiple entities now? User model, user.java. Can I create here product.java? Can I create employee.java, doctor.java, patient.java? You can create any number of entities. Okay. I'm giving the package name. In that package, you can have multiple entities and multiple repositories because a database means it is a collection of tables. Here I have taken one table as an example. You can have multiple tables also, no issue. You can have multiple tables also, no issue. Right. Guys, can you rectify this code? Can you rectify this code? Impossible. Even I can't rectify this. Even I cannot rectify this. So code is little bit complex. Code is a little bit complex in the configuration. That's why in every interview they are going to ask you this question: how to work with multiple databases. How to work with multiple databases. Okay. Yeah. What I am doing here is, guys, a simple thing is, what we are doing here is simple. Let me tell you what is happening here. What is happening here? We are configuring data source bean. We are configuring data source bean. We are configuring entity manager factory bean. Then we are configuring transaction factory, transaction manager. Okay. So this is data source bean. This is our data source bean. We are telling that this is a data source bean. We are telling that this is entity manager factory bean. Entity manager factory bean. And we are saying that this is transaction manager bean. We are saying that this is a transaction manager bean. Transaction manager bean. Okay, now what we are doing in the configuration? First we are declaring data source as one bean. Can you see this? Data source as one bean. Can I say that this is one bean? @bean annotation, name is equal to data source. It is reading use spring.user.data source properties and creating a data source object. Can I say data source is one bean? Can I say that data source is configured as one bean? Let's decode this code, guys. Let's decode this. Can I say data source is one bean? Can I say data source is one bean? Come on. Now, next one, what is there? Entity manager factory, we are taking as one bean. Entity manager factory, we are taking as one bean. In the entity manager factory, we are injecting the data source. In the entity manager factory, we are injecting the data source object. In the entity manager factory, we are injecting data source object. Now you see, entity manager factory method. In that method, I am taking data source as a parameter. In that, I am taking data source as a parameter. Whatever the data source we configure as a bean, that the data source bean, we are injecting into entity manager factory. So this is what is happening. This is what is happened. Data source bean is injected into entity manager factory bean. Data source bean is injected here. You got it? First data source we configured as a bean, which is going to read the data source properties from the properties file. Database driver class URL username password. It is going to load those properties. The data source bean we are creating. Guys, why we are using @bean annotation? Is IOC creating the object for the data source, or we are creating the object? Is IOC creating the object for that, or we are creating the object? We are creating the object. When we want to create the object, then we will give @bean. That is called customization. That is called customization. I'm customizing this bean, data source bean. Once the data source bean is created, I am creating entity manager factory bean. I'm creating entity manager factory bean. What I am doing for the entity manager factory bean? What I am doing for the entity manager factory bean? What I am doing for the entity manager factory bean? I am passing data source object. Why I am using @primary? Why I am using @primary? There are two entity manager factories available. One is book entity manager factory Another one is the user entity manager factory. Always I want to give the first priority for the Oracle database. That's why Oracle data source is the primary and Oracle entity manager factory is the primary. Oracle transaction manager is the primary. So we discussed about auto wiring. When we go for auto wiring with by type, there is a chance of getting the conflict. How can we resolve the conflict? When you have more than one candidate eligible for auto wiring, by using @primary. @primary means giving the priority. When there are two beans belongs to same type, I want to give the priority to particular bean. For that I will use @primary annotation. Okay. Now, how many data sources available? Two data sources available. One is user data source, another one is book data source. One is user data source, another one is book data source. For this entity manager factory, which data source I want to pass? User data source I want to pass. That's why I am giving qualifier. Now if you go for book DB, which data source I am giving? Book data source I am giving. Qualifier means we are telling which bean we have to inject. In the auto wiring, we discussed about these topics. When to go for qualifier, when to go for primary. In the auto wiring, I have explained when to go for primary and when to go for qualifier. You got my point now? Data source object. You understand what is there in the data source? Data source contains database properties. From the data source object, we are creating session factory. In that session factory, we are injecting the data source object. And we are telling auto DDL, we are giving entity class package. Okay. Then after, once we have entity manager factory, we are injecting entity manager factory into transaction manager. Inject and inject. Dependency injection. How we are injecting entity manager factory into transaction manager factory? By using qualifier. You see. Entity manager bean is injected into transaction manager. Entity manager factory is injected into transaction manager. So with this, our data source is ready to connect with one database. For one database, one data source, and we created one entity manager factory. With that entity manager factory, we created transaction manager factory. This is for user database, guys. If you have a single database, all this logic will be taken care by Spring Boot. Now you understand the power of the Spring Boot? This much code will execute in the background if you have a single database. That will be taken care by Spring Boot. Samjhe? If you have more than one database, boot cannot identify, you write your configuration. Same thing, go for book DB. I'm telling it has to scan these repositories. This is book data source. For the data source, this is the entity manager factory and this is the transaction manager. Total 3 beans we are configuring. One is data source, another one is entity manager, another one is transaction manager. One is data source, second one is entity manager, third one is transaction manager. This is data source, this is entity manager, and this is transaction manager. This is for one database. Similarly, for book database, we are configuring this. Book data source. Here I am not writing primary. Primary is giving for user DB. Book data source, book entity manager, book transaction manager. That's it. 2 entity classes we have taken. Now, when you go to our application, REST controller, I have one REST controller. In the REST controller, I'm taking book repository, I'm taking user repository. I'm taking book repository and I'm taking user repository. Okay. So when I call user repository.save all, where this data will be saved, guys? Where the user data will be saved? In the user table. Where the book data will be stored? In the book table. User repository belongs to which data source? User data source. User data source belongs to Oracle database. So whenever you call user repository.save all, your data will be inserted into user table which is available in the user database. Whenever you call book repository.save all, book repository belongs to book data source. Book data source belongs to MySQL database. So book data will be inserted into MySQL table. So user repository belongs to user data source. Book repository belongs to book data source. I'm injecting two repositories into my REST controller. Basveshwar, why you will write a separate configuration for every entity, man? One configuration for all the entities. One configuration for complete database. In the database you can have 100 tables also, no problem. Configuration class is only one. If you will write the separate configuration for every entity, if I have 1000 tables, will you write 1000 configuration classes? No. Here I am giving the package name. Inside this package you can have n number of entities. For all the entities in one table, only one configuration class. That's it. Now, can you look at this REST controller? I have taken a demo REST controller. In the demo REST controller, I have a book repository, user repository. Book repository belongs to book data source. User repository belongs to user data source. User repository will insert the data into Oracle table. Book data source will insert the data into book table. Okay. Guys, let me make some changes here. I don't have MySQL database in my system. I'm going to configure H2 database. What I will configure here, guys? H2 database. I will configure, for a book table I will configure H2 data source. Okay. Now, what are the H2 data source properties? H2 database is Springboard. I want to show you the live demo. Let me add this H2 dependency in the pom.xml. One database is Oracle. I have Oracle in my system. Another database I will use H2. To show you the demo. Yeah, H2 already available. Just add the H2 properties. jdbc.h2:mem:/testdb. jdbc:/h2:mem:/testdb. That is the URL. Driver class name org.h2.driver. Okay. Now, let me run my application, which is running on the port number 9090.